Aloha! My name is Shelby Morrison, and I am the Programs and Communications Coordinator at ikahi Mediation Center. Welcome to our Finding Solutions Growing Peace Brown Bag Lunch series. Ikahi is a nonprofit community mediation center serving East Hawaii. We were founded in 1983 as a program of the island of Hawaii's YMCA, and in 2006, we became our own independent nonprofit. So we are celebrating 20 years. We empower people to come together, to talk and to listen, to explore options and to find their own best solutions. To achieve this mission, we offer mediation, facilitation, and trainings just like this one to strengthen the ability of diverse individuals and groups to resolve interpersonal conflicts and community issues. Our Brown Bag Lunch series is held every third Thursday at 12 noon right here on Zoom. And you do need to register on Eventbrite each time to make sure you get that Zoom link. Our next Brown Bag event we have coming up will be next month on September 17th, and that will be with Ms. Joy Reese, and her talk is titled The Choice for Peace: Intention, Attention, Meaning, Attitude, and Response. And you can register for that on Eventbrite. I'll pop the link into the chat. Another event coming up is our Basic Mediation Training Fall Series, and this starts on September 24th and goes through September 26th. This 3-day training is how our professionally trained volunteer mediators get their start. These fabulous folks donate their time to help community members communicate, negotiate, and resolve disputes. And we're always looking for additional community members to learn conflict prevention and resolution skills. So please do consider joining our mediator apprenticeship program after your training. Registration closes on September 18th, and partial needs-based scholarships are available. More information can be found on our website. I'll pop that link into the chat. At the end of today's talk, we will ask you to fill out a short online survey, which helps with our grant funding for this free series. So when I put the survey link in the chat at the end of the talk, please just take a moment to give us your thoughts. I'll also be sending out an email later with that survey link and the video link if you would like to rewatch this recording. So without further ado, let me introduce our topic: conflict is an opportunity. How mediators can work with discomfort. And our speaker is Miss Sue Theiss, and she has been an Ombudsperson and mediator for over 30 years. Sue has served in Ombuds roles at Seattle University, Oregon State University, University of Arkansas, and the University of Arizona. As an Ombuds, Sue provides conflict management services, including mediation and training, to her university constituents and Ombuds peers. Sue earned her bachelor's in business admin and a master's in communication. Take it away, Sue.
Good afternoon, everyone. I guess I should say aloha, though. I got to get that one right. I think it's still afternoon for everybody, though, so hopefully we're good with that. I wish I could meet you all in person. I'm so glad we have this avenue so that I can connect with all of you. And I'm going to pull my screen up here real quick and make sure you all can see it. A little thumbs up from folks. Can you see the slides? Yep, great. Okay. As Shelby mentioned, I'm going to have an activity. Actually, it's not too far from the start of this, using a piece of paper, just preferably any kind of 8.5 by 11 sheet will be great, or any size paper, but definitely something that you don't want to keep because you're going to be tearing it up. So we want to be sure that you have something you can discard afterwards. Throughout the session, I am going to ask you some questions at times. You can feel free to use the chat. I can't manage that too well while presenting, so Shelby's offered to help me out, kind of reading, whatever the messages are, responses to some of the questions and activities that we engage with. So thank you for that. Conflict as an opportunity. I think my understanding is they have a variety of ranges of experts participating today. Some of you might be kind of new to just conflict in general, and others have been maybe mediating for some time. But I think all of us probably think of conflict as an opportunity, but when we're helping folks move to mediation or some similar tool, that's not how they're feeling, right? They're not saying, oh, I'm super excited about getting into this mediation. They're pretty anxious. And it's our job and our role to help them feel safe and reduce that discomfort or distress or wherever they're at along the way. So most of what I talk about is applicable in the intake stage and as you're working with folks up front. But if you're like me, if you work with folks who have to continually engage with the people they had the conflict with, they have to keep a relationship over time. If you're a community mediator, if you're mediating within your organization, or doing family mediation, there's ongoing relational commitments that these folks have. But it's not like a one-time thing to come in and get through mediation. So we really want to help them feel, be able to kind of self-regulate and can help co-regulate with them to get their body and their emotions in a place where they feel like they can be thinking and acting productively. So I'm going to focus on two things. One, I'm going to do a real quick, well, actually not so quick, good portion of the time I'm going to spend talking about the basics of conflict, which some of these concepts will not be new to you. I've listed a few researchers on some of the slides. So a lot of things are research-based, but my hope is to frame things in a way that seem like common sense, because part of this is to understand that folks feel a sense of comfort and trust in the system, and sort of empowers them to present themselves well when you're actually educating them on what you know about conflict and how those dynamics work. I often get feedback from my visitors and what you might call clients, I call visitors, about this just felt good when we're done with our first meeting. Oh, I feel better. This normalized my experience, or I feel like I have some tools to communicate with people now. So I want to make them simple. Like I said, some of it's a refresher, some of it's new for folks. And then I also want to focus a little bit on understanding how our bodies react in ways that we can't typically control when we initially are in distress or something has escalated for us, and then how to keep those things in mind when we're working with folks. So that's the overview. If you have quick questions, clarifying questions along the way, go ahead and try them in the chat and Shelby will help me address those. So, we all have ideas of what we think conflict is. And if you were old school like me, you used to open a Webster's dictionary, you'd find, conflict as a dispute, an argument, a battle, a clashing of ideas, nothing that feels warm and fuzzy. I like this particular definition. It's a discomforting difference at the very least. The difference between something that's a problem to solve between people versus an actual conflict is you feel uncomfortable, right? It's not easy. And conflict happens on a continuum anywhere from intrapersonal conflict. Maybe I have not had a conversation with this person before. They seem very different from me. I'm not sure how they're going to respond, so I'm getting myself kind of worked up, to an ongoing conflict between two people, to a bullying situation or a toxic environment, all the way to a crisis situation. And of course, all along that continuum, we have options for how to interact and how to choices on what our strategies are for intervening in our communication choices. There's also all these elements that are just always at play that we have to keep in mind. There's an interdependence. If whatever's going on, if there wasn't another person or another group involved, it probably wouldn't be a conflict, right? We're worried about how's that person going to respond to me, or how are my actions going to impact somebody else. There's always some difference. We know we're all unique individuals. We're going to respond to things differently. The more we see the other person as having a different perspective or approach than us, the more difficult that is to engage with them. And even though as ADR practitioners, mediators, ombuds people, we might see those differences as complementary, most people feel a sense of opposition. They feel like, oh, you're on the other side of the situation than I am. I feel like your position has pushed me to a place that I don't want to be, or that I need to defend myself in order to get my needs met. So all those things are always at play. And I would say the most challenging part is that we can't negotiate people's emotions or values, right? They are what they are, and people bring their different needs, values, and emotions with them to every conflict and every situation. So those are the things we have to remember are always at play. And where do we start? We know this. We start with communication, right? We establish relationships with each other based on how we communicate with each other, and our choices can change along the way. I think of communication as like playing catch. communication, the tough part about it is it's always receiver oriented. So no matter how skillfully you deliver your message, you throw the ball to somebody else, it may not land very well because they are the receiver of that message, depending on what the context is, the circumstances, how they perceived what you're sending them, they may not fully receive it. And if you don't allow an opportunity for a back and forth dyadic process where you can adapt how you communicate with the other person. Let's say you send the ball over to them. In this particular picture, there's a young man trying to choose who to throw the ball to in his family. He's probably going to throw it differently to mom, who seems ready to catch the ball, than to his little sister, who doesn't seem to know what's going on and might hit her, right? So he's probably going to give whoever he's sending the message to a heads up. My lights just went off. We're very climate focused here in the Northwest, so lights go off if they don't feel us moving. So he's probably going to, depending on who he's sending the ball to, he's going to decide how he's going to throw it, right? Same thing with sending a message out. Depending on who's going to receive it, what you know about them, you're going to package your message the best way possible. And we know from working with folks who get into conflict, they don't always package their message the best way for the person receiving it. So I want to make sure we help them find that dyadic, adaptive approach, that back and forth, allowing for feedback, allowing for adjustments in order for communication to be effective. All right, well, this is where I'm going to stop sharing just for a minute. Grab your pieces of paper, and I'm going to turn my light back on. Be right back. There we go. That worked. All right, does everybody have a piece of paper? All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to give you some instructions. And when we're done, I'll group us back together again. So first, hold the paper in both hands. All right, and next, fold the paper in half. All right, now tear off the lower left-hand side of the paper. Now fold it in half again. Now tear off the upper right-hand side of the paper. Fold it in half again. And if you're really strong, tear off the lower right-hand side of the paper. All right, so if I communicated perfectly and you all listened well, we should all have the exact same snowflake, right? So go ahead and pull up your snowflakes and let's see what they look like. Anybody who's got their, looks like some others have used this in their training. Great. All right, no two snowflakes alike. All right, so, I gave you all the same instructions. You all had a similar piece of paper. So what happened? What could I have done differently as the communicator to have helped you? If my goal was for us to have a similar snowflake at the end, what could I have done as the communicator? You can unmute yourselves or put something in the chat. Paula.
You could have told us which direction to fold the paper once we cut off one of the corners.
Right, I just said fold it, right? I didn't say which direction or, yeah. What else?
We've got some comments. Be more specific. You could have modeled it, shown a completed snowflake, clarified understanding, given a visual demonstration, and check at each step. Check if people were getting the directions correctly. What size paper should have been mentioned?
Right. I was a terrible communicator, wasn't I?
Mine doesn't look like a snowflake. Mine either.
Yeah. was a
Tell us
terrible
we were
communicator.
making a snowflake.
Yeah, I said hold it in two hands. I didn't say vertically or horizontally. I didn't tell you which half. I did one at my own pace. I didn't check to see if you guys were ready for the next step. There was really not much I did as a communicator. How about as a listener? What could you have done differently?
Ask clarifying questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we know this naturally while we're going through this activity, right? We think about this, but how often do we get people? I don't know about you, but I get somebody in my office one day, someone the next day. They haven't asked any clarifying questions. They have just talked, across each other. And that's how they end up with us, right? Getting ready for mediation. Paula, did you still have another question? No? Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. All right, so half of the communication is the communicator, right? Thinking about what information that you need. But I could have also said, please be sure to ask me questions along the way, right? I could have invited that. I could have shown you, and then people could have, if you were really wanting to get the details right, you probably would have asked me, what do you mean by that? And you would have been given the opening. So whenever that communication, when I say it's a dyadic process, and I would need to adapt. Oh, I'm not giving you enough information. I need to give you more specifics. I won't know that unless you're telling me, or if I offer up the opportunity up front. All right. Was there anything else that and I noticed a couple, I think one or two folks said they actually do this in trainings. I like doing it for virtual trainings because it's a nice one. All right. So yeah, so we need to have that two-way dyadic process. I'm just going to get my file back here. Okay. Make sure we pick up where we left off. Okay. All right. Everyone can see this again? Great. All right. So yeah, communication's dyadic. We have to take some responsibility as the communicator. And of course, we can model all this as the mediator when we're meeting with folks and helping them kind of coach them along the way around how to be a good listener and how to communicate well. Practicing and modeling, good habits as we're working with folks. I like to actually think about what are my bad habits and make sure I'm not in a bad space. I'm meeting with folks. I know for me, if at the end of the day, I'm listen to folks all day long and it's exhausting, right? If you're really being a good listener, it's really tiring. So when you get home into working with your, my kids were teenagers, or if I had a sibling call and they would, be talking for a little bit, I just tune out. So we need to make sure we're in a good place as mediators, but we're also making sure that our the clients that we're serving are ready to be good listeners as well. Not looking around the room, being in social, making sure you're engaged in the conversation, not rehearsing what you're going to say necessarily. We want them to be prepared, but not rehearsing during the moment. Not being distracted. We know what all the bad practices are, so we want to help folks not go there. Asking questions, paraphrasing, you guys just mentioned that. It's an important part of being a good listener and being able to get the information that you need to be looking at the same picture. Managing your nonverbals. I don't know if y'all can see me. I'm folding my arms like this. So what does it mean if Sue's got her arms crossed and I'm sitting with somebody? What kinds of things does that mean?
You're guarded, like you're not ready to take in anything.
That can mean that I'm guarded. Anything else? Is there anything in the chat?
Could be tired.
Could be tired. Yeah.
We have a comment, not interested.
Not interested.
A habit, a show of authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Feeling self-protected,
Mm-hmm.
irritated.
Mm-hmm. So much we can read into body language, right? The truth is, usually when I'm doing that, I'm a big fidgeter, so I'm trying to keep my hands still, when I'm folding my arms. Somebody else might be cold. Those sorts of things, as far as when we're working with others, we just want to be careful of our own body language because there's just there's no book, no code that we can open, say when Sue folds her arms, it means this. right? Unless you know somebody really well. And with our clients, when you're working with them, if they get a little too hung up about the other person's body language, kind of remind them, how do you feel about your body language, when you're in distress, and how can we help make sure that you present yourself well when we're getting you together with the other party. But don't read too much into the person's body language, especially culturally. You get into different cultures, and maybe in the US we think of eye contact as being important to show you're listening, and in some cultures it's not. It's disrespectful. So also an awareness of culturally different things that we might communicate through nonverbal means. And of course, we want to help people reframe and think of better ways to frame their situations. So from my perspective, all communication is intercultural, right? We're all unique beings. We all process the paper tearing exercise differently, not just because I was a bad communicator, but we all take in some data, whether we see it, hear it, feel it. We make an inference about what that means based on those frameworks that we pull up each time that we take in some information. And then we imagine what's going on in the other person's head, or we imagine how we should behave based on those inferences. And unless we've truly asked those questions, gotten to know someone, we can have a lot of, probably heard the term attribution errors, make a lot of misassumptions around what the other person's needs and motivations are. Like I say, that intercultural communication is always present in every interaction that we have. We're all unique individuals. I'm going to process things through a path from Armenian. I have perspectives around genocide based on, my family history. I've lived in 6 different states. I've been in very different, in the US, culturally very different places. I've been a single mom. I'm over 60, all those things. And of course, the work that I do, hearing a variety of perspectives. I'm going to always pull up that lens every time I interact with someone else and interpret things through my unique lens. And these 4 pillars are always at play when we're interacting with folks. Our communication is often determined based on what's our cultural norms. What are our, whether it's related to, in this particular situation, am I talking to someone young or older? Culturally, comes from a very different place than me, a different background. Am I adjusting how I interact with folks, or how I hear things, the context of the situation, if it's valuable to me, maybe not to the other person. And there's always some sort of power dynamic at play that influences the communication choices that we make. Whether that power dynamic is we're part of a marginalized group in society, or if it's positional power or family status, and power. Those are all the pieces that are in play that really impact our communication choices and how we hear others when we're meeting with them and helping them navigate situations. I'm going to guess most of you are familiar with the 5 different strategies. They're based, the Thomas Kilmann strategies are actually based on some earlier work done by Sillars and Perry that said there's really kind of 3 approaches, they said, for folks addressing problems and conflicts: the avoidance, an adversarial, or a more cooperative approach. And I like the way they've broken these down a little bit more with Thomas and Kilmann. So I want to go through them a little and asking you at each time to think about kind of how you're feeling for each of those. But the first one, competitive dominant strategy, we know there's appropriate times for that. If you're in an emergency situation, someone's got to be in charge. In a military situation, maybe crisis situation. What happens though if you're in an ongoing relationship with someone personally, professionally, if you've got to get back together with them within the community, and all your interactions with them seem to be the other person's trying to win the argument or dominate the situation? How do you feel about that experience?
It's pretty stressful.
Yeah, very stressful, right? It seems like, of course, if there's a winner, there's a loser. You don't want to be on the losing side, but it's also exhausting, right? And when folks are meeting with me and I'm trying to kind of help them acknowledge that their experiences are normal, sometimes they feel like, yeah, someone else is kind of maybe abusing their power or dominating the situation. They say, I'm kind of worn out. I feel like I can't defend myself anymore. It's like, well, that's a normal response to where you're at. So we're going to try and help both of you kind of find a different way, to interact. How about accommodation? again, accommodating is great when you're new to an organization, you're trying to accommodate others' needs before you learn the culture. Maybe you're accommodating someone younger than you that's learning. But again, how do you feel if you're always accommodating someone in a personal relationship, or in a professional relationship or within a community? Are you feeling good?
Someone in the comments says eventually it might be draining.
Overextended boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Right. Draining. The other
Start to
person.
feel resentful, taken
Yeah.
advantage of, powerless.
Absolutely. Those are all perfect examples. And that's why we don't want to be in a relationship. It's not healthy to continually always accommodate everyone else's needs and not your own. There's a really good it's a YouTube video by Susan Rains on, she calls it 3-step problem solving. She takes a doctorate course in conflict management, and she talks about how conflicts are really based on unmet needs. And if you're always someone who's accommodating, or you're on the losing end of a adversarial conversation all the time, you're not getting your needs met, right? So a lot of conflicts happen from that. Avoidance, that's why we have ombuds and people within organizations to help with conflicts when people avoid dealing with them. We know they don't go away, right? They just escalate and then they get more difficult to address. So compromise and collaborate. Certainly those are both cooperative strategies, and typically when we're getting people in mediation, we're focusing more on collaboration, because a lot of times with compromise, people jump to that a little bit too quickly. And the better negotiator gets more instead of sort of the meat in the middle that you might need. Sometimes it's appropriate. There's only so much, you're helping people negotiate and they have only so much budget or time or resources. Sometimes you've got to compromise a bit, but I'm always trying to help my folks focus on collaboration, coming up with mutually beneficial solutions. And that's, of course, where mediation is a wonderful tool for that. All right, you might have heard the story before, but play along if you have. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between compromise and collaboration. And so imagine there's two sisters. They go down to their kitchen. They open up the refrigerator door, and there's one orange inside the refrigerator, and they both state their positions. They say, I want the orange. So what are their options? They both want the orange. Just one orange.
Cut it in half or share it, split it.
Yeah, that's kind of a common response. Go into compromise. That's a great solution there. There's only one resource, right? So one sister, she's hungry. She eats the inside of her half of the orange. The other sister, she's making a pie and she's going to grate the rind, excuse me, for her half of the orange to put onto a pie. So if they both stated their interests, one says, I'm hungry, the other one says, I'm making a pie, rather than their positions, they have nothing to argue about, really. They can both get 100% of what they want and come up with a solution that works for both of them. That's not always, an option, but many times it is, and we kind of tend to overlook it. So if nothing else, when I'm working with folks and I'm helping them reframe things, it's like, let's talk about, well, what are your interests and goals? People aren't going to usually argue with you about what you're interested about. They might argue with you about imposing your position on them, right? That doesn't feel good, and they want to push back. And when people feel emotionally pushed, just like when you're physically pushed, the natural inclination is to push back. So we want to help folks focus on those interests and goals. Something I didn't put in the slides, but you can scribble down on an untorn piece of paper. A tool that I like to share with some of my visitors, would be clients, is something called the TRIP goals. I don't know if you've heard them before. They spell TRIP. Wilmot and Hucker, where they talk about, there's really 4 types of goals that people have when they intentionally communicate with each other. The first one is topical. Excuse me. Second is relational. The third is identity. And the last is process. So topical goals might be things like, working on a project, I need you to use these resources, have this built by X date. Those are topical goals. Relational goals would be, Do you want to start a relationship, end a relationship, change a relationship? Your neighbors might have changed. Maybe you had a big friend group. Now it's the whole dynamic has changed, or a workplace group has changed. The family's had a divorce or a huge change. Those things change the relationships that are needed. Identity goals, those could be cultural identities that are very different from each other, or you might be part of a group that you need to be seen as credible. In a university environment, we have people going through tenure. They want to be seen as credible amongst their peers so they can get through tenure and keep their job. Or process goals, how things happen. And oftentimes when I'm helping people think about how they want to frame their goals when we get into mediation, for some folks, it's helpful to think of them in terms of those trip goals and to recognize that the other party's goals might be very different. Maybe they're trying to build a relationship and the other person just wants the process to be smooth. So if it's helpful for you, that's a little tool. Another thing, when I have folks meet with me that are, they say, I feel bullied, or I feel like this person just verbally attacking me all the time. I'm often asking them to share what kind of language is used. And sometimes they'll share things in writing. Healthy argumentativeness, which we, in a university environment, we encourage everybody to argue, right? We ask students to write reports and make an argument. We ask researchers to argue to make our research better. In workplaces, maybe in your community, you might argue about what's the best way to have things set up in your community. That's healthy argumentation. You're attacking the topic, you're addressing the issues. When that slides into dysfunctional verbal aggression, you're now attacking the person, their character, their identity. What do you think of their ability to do their job? What do you think of them as a neighbor? What do you think of them as a family member? Those are all personal attacks. And when those happen, especially when they happen in a repetitive way, people start to feel like they're being bullied, which is a form of harassment. And then that's where they can really start to, get sick if things, don't get addressed. And they might be in a place where they brought issues to you and you say, oh, for me, this doesn't seem like such a big deal. And then when you hear of all the verbal attacks that they've experienced, you can see where they might be in a place of real distress and trauma. So sometimes unraveling and asking what language is used I find is a really helpful tool to say, is this really, I need to help them get back to, no, it sounds like that person was trying to work through the issues with you versus, oh, this is a different kind of problem. This person was truly emotionally attacked in some way. I'm going to give you just a couple more things to think about. Trust triangle. There's also a wonderful video from Francis Bray around building and rebuilding trust that you could just do a quick search. The TED Talk. In its simplest form, I like how she talks about in order to build trust, whether you're helping the parties you're working with build trust with each other, or you're trying to build trust with the client working with you, there always need to be three things present in the communication. You need to be authentic, be your true self. Maybe not your true self in a locker room or, at a bar or something, but your true professional human self when you're interacting with folks. You always need to have some sound logic. Maybe the other person doesn't agree with your logic, but at least show that you've thought through what you're trying to present to the other person, and to show empathy. Even if you don't understand where the other person's coming from, to be able to acknowledge that this was hurtful for them, or that this was difficult for them to resonate with their values, to show some empathy in that. That's something you could model for your visitors, your clients, as well as kind of coach them on as far as, okay, when we're having the conversation and you're worried about how you're going to present yourself, be thinking about these things, as well as, sharing what your interests and goals are. All right, so for many of you, those might have been just a quick refresher on the dynamics of conflict. Hopefully you're thinking about them in terms of how could you maybe use some of the language and knowledge to help empower the people that you're working with, because they do feel typically a bit stronger and more confident going into any kind of mediated discussion. I want to talk more specifically about anger and distress. And I'm going to ask you, and you can throw this in the chat, just to throw in a list of what makes you angry. We're going to start there. Could be anything from politicians to bad drivers, but what makes you angry? And Shelby, if you start seeing things, if you can start reading them off.
Yes, we have Hurricane Lala,
Mhm.
funding cuts, not being heard, hurting children, people who lack compassion, disrespect, cruelty and injustice, economic disparities, inability to provide for client basic needs,
Mhm.
lack of care for all of our citizens.
Yeah.
I'll add
So-
corrupt politics to that.
Mhm. Yeah, so all of those things certainly can make any of us angry. Considering the list that Shelby just read off of, think about how many of those things can you actually control? And I don't mean influence, but how many can you actually control? Was there anything on that list?
I suppose if you're the one making sure you're not being disrespectful and you're not hurting children, and you can control
Yeah.
how you affect other people.
Exactly. I mean, that's the trouble with the things that make us angry, right? They're behaviors of other people, and we can't control other people's behaviors, just our responses. And that's easier said than done because since the beginning of time, we have a physical response to when we're angry or in extreme distress that we can't control in the moment. We have to be aware of it, come up with a way to work with it. For me, my physical responses, I know what they are. I get very quiet. I clench my jaw. For somebody else, you might feel sick to your stomach, clench your fists. Think about um, what your physical response is to when you get angry, and recognize that other people have that. And it's not just anger. Anger is always fueled by an emotion, feeling devalued, feeling not heard, feeling frustrated, feeling um, envious. Could be any kind of emotion that triggers that anger. They're all forms of distress, right? And could maybe trauma for some of us. So we all have an initial physical response that we can't really control. So in the moment, we have to think about, okay, check in with ourselves physically and know that my thinking brain, the hippocampus, is just shut down. The fight or flight, amygdala is just taken off. And that is not a good time to have a collaborative conversation. We just talked about how that's always beneficial, but it's not a good time to have that. And the people that we're working with, they can't have a good conversation if they're in that space either. Um, so I always say, we start with ourselves, right? Think about how to manage that. A lot of times I used to co-teach a course on conflict and anger management with a counselor, and she would have these students dissolve a lifesaver in their mouth while we were listing all the things that make us angry. And we would time it, and she'd say, it takes you at least the time to dissolve a lifesaver in your mouth to reassess yourself physically to say, am I still physically upset before you want to even think about having a conversation with someone? And you need to counter that physical response with something that works for you, whether it's listening to music, going for a run, I go for walks when I'm upset. I also have a lifesaver jar in my office. My visitors think it's for them. It's for me. When I'm angry, I pop in the lifesaver. Good 5 minutes later, it's like, oh, I'm still angry. And I get another one in there. And then I say, no, I should go for a walk. But think about how to counter that and also be able to help folks who are feeling distressed and angry. One of the things, of course, is you providing that safe space, the co-regulating conversations with them, also recognizing they didn't have any control when they got in trouble in their situation, or maybe even when they're first in their office sharing their story and they're upset about that physical response. You need to help give them the space to get them back to a place where they can be thinking through their concerns. I often, for folks who, are wanting to get a little coaching on, well, I work in an environment or I live in an environment where in the moment, I can't just walk away from someone, I always suggest to folks have a little catchphrase to say, you don't want to be dismissive, but say, hey, this is an important conversation for us to have. I need to go do X, or can we schedule a time to do that? So you give yourself enough time to get your thinking part of your brain back and your angry or fight or flight part kind of calm down a bit so that you can have a good conversation. So I love this sentence here. The more threatened our bodies feel, the more evolutionarily ancient our response is. It was a wonderful book called Our Polyvagal World by Stephen and Seth Porges. Stephen is the person who developed the polyvagal theory. I'm giving this a very small caption of what that looks like, but it helps me provide a little bit of a framework to recognize where folks are at when I'm meeting with them. And that place that we all hope to be, and we've all experienced distress, so we can relate to this. When we feel safe, we're in this green zone, a place of health, growth, social engagement, and feeling some restoration. When we feel safe, it increases our body's ability to physically heal, think critically, creatively, recuperate, socially connect, hear and listen. And it decreases our defensive systems, which we know is usually where people start when we get them, before a mediation. So if we can get them as much as possible back to this space, this green space where they feel safe, then we're in luck. We've done a good job. Most people, when they come in, again, they're not excited about getting into a mediation situation, even if that's the option that they've chosen. They're feeling somewhat threatened, maybe professionally threatened, emotionally threatened, uncomfortable with their neighbors, who knows what the situation, but they automatically, their body takes them into immobilization. That's the fight or flight stage. And that increases their defense systems, their blood pressure, heart rate go up, and their reactivity. It also decreases their ability to hear and process tones. When we say it's not what you said, but how you said it, sort of thing. Well, that calming tones that we normally use, to help folks, kind of feel safe. They won't even hear that, sometimes in a situation, or they'll hear things differently. So getting them again feeling comfortable in a space where they can regulate back closer to the green zone and be a little less defensive, a little more open to hearing different perspectives is important. And then the more serious responses when we feel kind of a life threat, that red system, that's immobilization. You probably met or heard from folks, depending on kind of mediation you do, if you work with domestic violence folks or people who've been in some really, physically unsafe or very emotionally unsafe situations that could freeze or shut down. Beyond this, you've probably heard appeasing, fawning. People even try to appease the person who's targeting or victimizing them to get through it. That's a very tough place to be. And at that stage, it increases immobilization and their pain tolerance. So, a lot of times I wonder, why is this person, I can't help move them to a safe space to have a good conversation. Maybe they need some time. Maybe they need some resources, other resources. Maybe they need to feel safe with you to get themselves back to a regulated place where they can start thinking about mediation as an option. I personally, like if someone's gone through some really severe bullying or they've been part of, harassment, and they've been traumatized in their history and they kind of present that way when a first meeting, it takes a lot of time. I might say, not right now, but when you're ready, mediation could be an option for you. We spent a lot of time together. I had someone recently that I just, after about 6 or 7 months, finally got him and his the coworker in for a mediation because they needed to be in a place where they felt safe. Does this make sense? I think kind of naturally as humans, we can kind of see, we know that we feel these ways that sometimes we know someone in our lives who can feel so distressed that it's hard to work with them. And I know we can't always solve that, but there's lots of things we can do to help folks feel comfortable and get back to a safer space so we can work with them. All right. If you have questions at the end, we can maybe answer those. All right. So I promised to pull it all back together, and I think I've just got a few minutes left, so we will do that. So if you've I know some of you maybe haven't gone through mediation training, but you've probably gone through some sort of how to work with folks if you're trying to help them resolve conflicts. I would say the intake is the same for every process, right? You start off by trying to achieve rapport with the person you're working with. It includes that effective listening that we talked about. It includes the communicating in a dyadic fashion. It includes reducing their fears. If you have some expertise in the situation or within your organization, a lot of times people have fears that you can alleviate by saying, that actually we have a policy against that, or actually the laws don't provide for, for those, anytime that you can provide a little information to reduce some of their fears, or to, if they have a fear of actually getting into a mediated conversation, discussing the process, what your role is going to be, how you're going to help them along the way. Anything like that at the beginning is great, and along the way. And with Achieve Rapport also, good time and place for them to meet with you. If you have the opportunity, I know most of the people who do community mediation, I think it's very similar to how I mediate. I always spend lots of times with each party up front, and I let them know I'm going to be working with the other person, and we do a lot of the work up front before we even get in a room together. I want them to be successful if we have a mediation. So good time, good place, good listening skills, as much as you can. Use some of your knowledge around how conflict works to help normalize their experience when you're talking with them, and gives them some confidence going into any kind of facilitated conversation. Boil down the issues. Think about the picture exercise, when you're working with them, helping them ask, either asking them the good questions yourself, reflecting back what you heard them say, listening for the whole message, helping them do that with anyone else involved, with anyone else involved in the conflict that you want to be working with. You want at least for them to be working with the same picture, but also knowing that they're going to see it differently given their unique cultural lenses. And then clarify interests and goals. Think about the sisters in the orange story. If you just share things in terms of your interests and your goals, what your needs are, you're less likely to have conflicts that will escalate. You're more likely to come up with solutions that work well together. And then also to recognize that people have different goals. They might appear conflicting at the beginning, but as long as everybody's acknowledging that all goals need to at least be addressed, then you have an avenue for conversation. And lastly, you can develop a game plan for communication. Anytime that I'm working with folks, there's always someone who's more hesitant than the other party before we get into a mediation. Sometimes just helping them think through, we're going to come up with the outcomes together with the other party, but before you get in there, think about the most important interests, goals, needs that you want to convey. Let's talk about how you feel comfortable conveying those in the language you're going to use, so that they can feel a little bit more empowered. And I always remind them that I'm there to make sure it goes smoothly. The very first mediation I did back in the 90s was with 2 librarians. And I thought, oh, this will be easy. They'll be nice. They're librarians, And boy, was I wrong. One was glaring at the other, using very abrasive language. The other person was literally shaking in her chair. And I had to stop the mediation, let them pause for a minute. Every time before I start a mediation, I let folks know about the language we're going to use, the way we're going to interact with each other. I don't care how professional you think they are going into a situation. I always assure everyone it's my job to make sure that we're going to interact in a thoughtful way with each other and outline what that looks like. Okay, I talked pretty much straight for a long time. So were there any questions along the way that I missed? Don't see anything in the chat.
I'm
Nothing
just curious.
yet.
I'm just curious how it turned out with the librarians.
We worked it out. It was I was the one distressed actually in the room more so than they were. Yeah, and I think in that one I did for the woman who was shaking, and not having understood the dynamic as much as I needed to. I did apologize to her later, so in reflection, I should have made the ground rules a little bit clearer from the beginning, and stopped things a little sooner. But I think we all, if we're good mediators, we all fail forward, right? We learn from, how. I don't think I've actually harmed anybody by doing mediation. People always come up with some sort of positive outcome. But we always can reflect on what we could have done better, right? And to help people feel a little bit safer and more effective in the moment. All right. Well, I know I said I wanted
Go
to
ahead,
present.
Paula.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I have 2 questions. One is, do you ever use any kind of grounding or calming protocol right at the outset if you feel that there's a lot of tension between the two with whoever, if it's more than one person?
Yeah, in my role, I'm fortunate that I can spend time with folks ahead of time before we get into immediate conversation. I know some maybe court-referred mediations people don't feel they can do that, but I think most mediators have that option. I've always chosen to meet with people first. So I have, before we actually get into the room together, I've had lots of opportunity for each person to make sure they're as comfortable as they can be, that I've helped them address, either gotten other resources if they need to be, working with a therapist while we're working together, to make sure everybody's going to be successful. And I've not, there are some things I won't mediate, if somebody's been sexually harassed, and those things come in, it's, harassment's not really a good place for mediation. With that said, so I've done some victim offender mediation at previous institutions, and if people agree who the offender and the victim are, then that's appropriate, for that situation. But in most things that come to my attention, I think for most folks, people aren't always in agreement about there's a right or a wrong. It's about we have competing needs, and we got in a lot of escalated situations. So I don't know if that answered your question, but because I have that opportunity to meet with folks ahead of time, I feel pretty good by the time we get into immediate discussion. With that said, there's challenges. If I have someone I'm working with who's neurodivergent, they're usually aware, of what their challenges might be and working through a mediation. So I have to be sure everyone feels safe, in that environment with whatever unique concerns coming up.
I had another quick question. I don't know if there's time to answer it, but when you have developed a plan for communicating needs, and I wonder if that's often something written or it's a verbal agreement of how we're gonna, you're gonna text me or you're gonna, what does something like that look like?
Oh, yeah, and let me reframe that. I'm suggesting when you're working with whoever your clients are, to help them come up with their own plan for how they're going to communicate as far as how are they going to communicate their interests and goals. For example, if I have people that say, I don't know what I'm going to do when I get in there, I don't know how to start. I say, well, okay, let's talk about how you can do that without coming up with a solution, because the solutions we're going to work on together. But perhaps list 2 or 3 things that your interests and goals that you want to make sure you need to get met in some way. And they might write those few things down. Then we talk about, okay, how can you frame your concerns and your interests and goals in a way that's not attacking the other person, right? Or not deciding on solutions the other person doesn't want. So that plan is really individualized to that person to help them think about ways they can present themselves as effectively as possible. The mediation that I do is I don't write up contracts because I'm an Ombudsperson. I can't keep records. What I do is I just get a verbal nod on confidentiality. I let them know if they come up with some agreements they want to keep with each other. I'll write them on the board and they take a picture and they leave. I know for other mediators, they have to write a contract. When I did the victim offender mediation, for example, when I was in Arkansas, was with students. We did have an agreement that they would take back to their conduct office. But beyond that, because I'm an ombudsperson, I don't keep records.
We have another question in the chat. I'm curious of any major aha moments that made you substantially adjust your approach in future mediations.
I would say for me, it was more in working with group kind of, and I don't even call working with groups mediation anymore. I call it more facilitation, and I have different tools now that I use. But I was at the University of Arizona, and they have some satellite campuses there, and I was early in my career as an ombudsperson, and I had someone who was going to co-facilitate a conflict out at one of these satellite campuses. It's near where there's an Air Force base out there. And, talk about not knowing your group. I thought I'd done my homework. I had heard from a few folks of what they thought the issues and the conflicts were. These were students, but they were also not the traditional age students. They were spouses of folks that were on the base. So I thought I'd done my homework. I knew what the issues were. My co-facilitator got sick. I said, that's okay. I know what I'm doing. I get out there and they had everything set up in a circle. I was using a mediation-like approach to the conversation. And somebody threw a box of tissues in the middle of the room and said, "Good luck." And I thought, oh, what did I miss? What I didn't quite understand is that it's very different for those who have to live and learn and work together, who can't leave their conflicts, in that room, and these were all female students who were married to men on the base. They did everything together. And so it was really difficult. They could never get away from the situation. And I would have taken a very different approach and facilitated it very differently if I'd fully understood those dynamics. Basically, when folks had contacted me and I heard from the dean, I just heard what their conflicts were and the dynamics. And it's like, okay, I know how to do this. Since then, of course, I've learned quite a bit about understanding groups and conflict climate and dynamics, and I do a lot more work and have very different approaches on doing that. So, mediation is a great tool in the right circumstances, but it's not the right tool for everything. And I took that approach with this group, and it wasn't the right one. Again, I didn't hurt them. It didn't make it worse, but could have been a lot better. So it was a big aha moment for me, for sure.
All right. Any other questions for Sue? All right. Looks like everyone is satisfied.
Yay.
So
All
wonderful,
right.
everybody. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pop our survey link into the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. If everyone wants to give Sue some kudos in the comments or leave some emojis. As a reminder, please just take a few minutes today or tomorrow and fill out our short online survey, which helps with our grant funding for this free series. That survey link is in the chat. And also be sure to check your email a little bit later today for that video link to rewatch today's presentation and that survey link once more. So mahalo, Sue, and
Mahalo.
thank you all for coming.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month.